Hey, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Um, Sorry, I'm just dealing with some work stuff. Anyways, so I'm working on what I hope to be some article on uh, AI and the legal field. And one thing that I'm working on, or sort of looking into talking about, is the frame problem in AI. And of course, because I think of everything in MBTI or cognitive function terms, um, it got me thinking about how it serves as a good way of explaining intuition, both introverted intuition and extroverted intuition, which I'll get into. Um, and I'm not the only one who's thought this, because I did sort of a Google search and saw that people have talked about it in various forums and stuff. So there's probably stuff out there, and this is just me going to be rambling about it, trying to organize my thoughts around the issue. So let me start off by explaining what exactly the frame problem is, and then how I think it relates to how we think of introverted intuition and extroverted intuition in various ways. So it's this old sort of logical problem that in computation and AI. And the best way to sort of to describe it is to use a famous thought experiment that was written or put out there by Dan Dennett, who's one of the more well-known cognitive science philosopher types. He wrote Consciousness Explained, which doesn't really explain consciousness, but it's still a good book worth reading and knowing his stuff. I think he just recently passed away too. But anyways, he was sort of the master at coming up with these thought experiments that explain relatively complicated um, concepts in theory of the mind, cognitive science, AI, computational science, all that stuff. So here it is. So the thought experiment is, you've got a robot, and the robot is programmed and knows well enough that it has a battery that it needs to survive. And the robot also knows that the battery is in a room, and in that room there's also a bomb that's set to go off. And the robot has some sort of sense of self-preservation, so it goes into the room and tries to remove the battery from the room with the bomb in it, so that the bomb doesn't explode and therefore blow up his battery and therefore kill him in the process. Okay. Um, so he's got goal oriented behavior. He knows his initial state, he knows the state that he wants to be in, and he knows enough about the world that he just needs to go into the room and remove the bomb from the room. So he goes in there. Turns out that the bomb is on a wagon. So the robot thinks to itself, okay, all I need to do is pull the wagon out of the room, and the battery will come with it, and I'll get the battery out of the room. But what he doesn't realize is that the bomb is also on the wagon. So when he pulls the wagon out with the battery, he's also pulling the bomb out, and boom, it explodes, and no more robot, no more battery. Okay, so people who design the robot go back to the drawing board, and this is where the frame problem starts coming to play, where now they realize, okay, we need to program this thing so that it takes into account the consequences of its actions, or what we might call side effects of its actions. And so we need it to realize, okay, if I pull the wagon and the bomb is on the wagon, that the bomb's going to come with the battery. So we need to somehow make it realize or know that it has to remove the battery without the bomb, either take it off the wagon or take the bomb off the wagon, whatever. But to do that is actually very computationally, if you're just programming, simple procedures, if this, then that, if this, then that, is very difficult to do because you need to program. I mean, not just this scenario. That's a relatively easy, well-defined space. But if you want to program a robot that's generally flexible and takes into account its consequences of its actions, in the world, then that is, almost computationally untenable, because you send the robot into the room, and then it starts it has to compute the effect of every action that it takes. Right? You're not just programming it to remove the bomb. You're trying to program it to take into account, if I do this, then how is that going to change the state of the world? And that turns out to be very hard. So you program the robot to take into account all possible states of the world given its actions, and of course it's going to blow up just thinking about every little action and every little effect that it might have, right? Because it's going to have a bunch of irrelevant stuff. Like, if I pull the wagon, then the wheels are going to start spinning. And if I pull the wagon, then the wagon is not going to turn into a dinosaur. If I pull the wagon, the temperature is not going to change. The temperature will stay the same. If I pull the wagon, it's not going to break any windows. If I pull the wagon, boom, the bomb goes off, right? So you can't really just have the robot try to figure out every effect of its actions, and what's relevant and what's not relevant, or it's going to blow up. Or sorry, I got ahead of myself. In the second part of this problem, if you just try to program the robot to say, okay, take into account the effect of your actions, every effect of your action, then it's going to do things like compute irrelevant information, like the temperature is not going to change, I'm not going to break a window, the wagon isn't going to magically turn into a dinosaur, that kind of stuff. And it's just computationally untenable. Okay. So then you have to build a robot that somehow figures out what is relevant information and what's irrelevant information, right? And that is really the essence of the frame problem that the philosophers and the computer scientists and programmers really haven't come up with a good solution to. And it's been around, since the 60s, and there's some, philosophical arguments, epistemological type stuff. You can get real deep into this issue, but the point is that nobody's really come up with a viable solution to it. But it's very easy for humans to do. I mean, we, as a species, have somehow figured out the answer to the frame problem, right? So if you ran into that room and instead of a battery being on the wagon, it's like a baby or something that you're trying to save, you would instinctively automatically know, okay, if the bomb is on the wagon with the baby, pick the baby up and run out of the room, or take the bomb off the wagon and run and pull the baby out. But either way, you don't want the bomb coming with you. And you figure out all that stuff real quickly, right? You don't have to think about, is the temperature of the room going to change? Am I going to break any windows? Is the wagon going to turn into a dinosaur? All that kind of stuff is irrelevant, right? So the problem, the description of the problem is figuring out relevance or realized relevance. Okay. And I won't go into the details, the computational details or the formal logic that sort of underlies all this stuff. But if you're real interested, look up the Yale shooting problem, and just do like a ChatGPT or Google search on the frame problem, and you can dig pretty deeply into why it's an issue computationally, and it has to do with, you know, something is valid at one point in time, but then the world changes, and now the validity of that thing changes. And how do you figure out, okay, what's going to change and what's not going to change? And if something does change, is it relevant or not? Okay. So, introverted intuition and extroverted intuition. What are they doing? So, the magic box in our brain, in our cognitive functions, somehow figures this out, right? Now, if you can figure out the answer of how the brain is doing it, then congratulations, you'll at least win a Fields Medal, if not a Nobel Prize. But um, but we can at least sort of think about how this sort of plays out in personality world, cognitive function world. So let's think about what intuition's doing. So you get extroverted intuition, and I think you need both of them to solve this problem. I don't think you could solve it with just extroverted intuition or introverted intuition, but I do think you need both um, to solve it in a meaningful way. So the extroverted intuition is going to be looking at all the different possibilities, right? Like all the different states of the world that might unfold given your actions, right? Um, and it's got to do it, and it's got to be extroverted intuition because it's associated with sort of meaning and that sort of metaphysical knowledge about the world. Um, assume that you've never faced the problem before and you can't rely on your SI or your experience or some sort of you know guidance that you received or rule of thumb or something that somebody gave you along the way, right? It really is like a new problem to you. You've got to sort of assess the situation and figure out, okay, what if I do X, what are the possible states of the world that might emerge given my actions? And of course, this is going to tie into TE and FE and all that stuff. I mean, none of this stuff is in a vacuum, but at the very core of it, the first thing you need to do is build up some sort of knowledge base about what the state of the world could be. So NE is going to sort of do that mental sketch pad kind of work of if this then that. Here are the various side effects of my actions, right? But the NI is going to do the relevance realization part of it. Of okay, well, what's relevant? Like the fact that if I grab this baby out of the wagon and run out of the room, the temperature's not going to change and no windows are going to break and the wagon's not going to turn into a dinosaur. None of that's relevant, right? And so we can ignore all that, and your NI is somehow sort of serving as like a brake or like a backstop in a way to your NE, right? It's keeping it from going haywire and just sort of thinking of all possible scenarios, all possible different changes, states of the world that are just frankly irrelevant. Okay, so that's sort of the fundamental thing about the frame problem. And introverted intuition, extroverted intuition are going to somehow work together to figure out, okay, I'm at point A. Now what, and I want to get to point B. How do I not even it's sort of figuring out what point B is, I guess, is a way of putting it, right? Like, where do you want to be? Where do you want your goal state to be? And filtering out the irrelevant information. Okay. So in that sense, it is sort of like seeing into the future, however you want to think about it. And then once you sort of figure out like what you want your goal state to be, then TE or FE, depending on what you're dealing with, is going to come in and sort of figure out the operationals, the subroutines, to get you from point A to point B. Okay, so how does this manifest itself? And this is what I was sort of mulling over. Like, what's sort of the practical implication or practical takeaway from this? And so sort of thinking of like, okay, what happens if somebody's unipolar or unipolar, and how can this sort of manifest itself with them having some sort of issue with the frame problem? And thought of a couple of examples. So my son, I'm pretty sure, is an ISTP, and I'm almost 90% sure, but you never know. But he's always been very athletic, like ISTPs tend to be. Very good eye-hand coordination, and it was very obvious at a very early age that he had really good, just sort of knew how to move around, had really good eye-hand coordination, and so we would sign him up for all these sports. And when kids are really little, all they do are just sort of drills, right? Like you give them a basketball and they'll teach them how to dribble, right? Or they'll teach them how to shoot it into the hoop. And that's really just all sort of eye-hand coordination. Same with soccer. They'll do little drills, and if a kid's relatively athletic and has good coordination, they'll do well on the drills. And so he was always one of those kids that did well on these little drills. But then they get old enough and they start putting him in real games, right? And and he was doing basketball and he was doing soccer. And what ended up happening is he went from a state of a well-defined problem, right? I'm going to give you a basketball and I want you to shoot it and put it in the hoop, right? Or I'm going to give you a basketball and I want you to dribble from this line down to that line and then back, right? Very well-defined problem. You know what you're supposed to do. And he's got the coordination to do it, okay? But then you throw somebody into like a soccer game or a basketball game, and now you've got other people playing the game that are all trying to get the ball, and they're all trying to score, and you've got the ball, and yeah, you could shoot it. You're pretty good at shooting it as a little kid. But now all of a sudden you've got this kid that's like a foot taller than you, like in your face, with his hand in your face. And you've gone from a well-defined problem to what we call an ill-defined problem, right? Where you have to sort of map out the problem space and be like, okay, what do I do now? And it was just very chaotic for him. He didn't like it, even though he liked the drills and doing, shooting the baskets or dribbling the soccer ball or kicking the ball into the goal or whatever, those individual well-defined things. He hated, having to deal with the chaos of playing with other kids, right? Because now all of a sudden you have to sort of figure out that problem space. Now, of course, because he's ISTP, in my opinion, he's going to be unipolar, right? And so I think that played into it. So moving forward, even we found things that were more of a defined problem type of sport, like golf. Like he loves golf. He's a very good golfer, very well defined. You don't have some kid who's a foot taller than you with his hand in your face, right? Like it's a well defined problem that's not very chaotic. Yes, the ball might go somewhere unexpected, but it's within the parameters, right? It's within sort of expected parameters. And he also plays baseball, and baseball is also sort of this sport that's well thought of as like a well-defined problem, right? And it's really just eye-hand coordination and just sort of knowing the rules, right? Very rule-based, but there's not a whole lot of chaos involved. Every once in a while, you'll see a breakdown where somebody throws a ball past somebody, they don't catch it, and then all hell breaks loose, and you got to recover. But in general, as long as everybody's sort of executing and doing what they're supposed to do, it's a very well-defined problem state. And so if you're an ISTP and you're in polar, my argument would be that is probably a better environment, or a better situation. Get some comments. Okay, I'll get back to your comments in a minute. Sorry, I do these live things because I don't know. I sort of just like to ramble and don't. And if I record it as a video, uh, I just can't force myself to put it up. So live sort of helps me do it. But I will get back to your comment. Okay, got an INFJ sending out the INFJ bat signal here. Okay, so back to the ISTP. Well-defined problems they enjoy, and I think it's because of this frame problem issue of any is going to allow you to sort of explore the different possibilities, the different things. And yeah, sports is in the physical world, but there's also sort of a lot of thinking about, like, okay, how do I deal with this sort of situation? So I haven't completely thought through this whole thing, but I think it's different. It's different than an SE problem. In I mean, SE is going to be dealing with sort of the here and now. NE is sort of the bigger picture, right? Of like, how do I deal with all this chaos? And then and how do I sort of how do I get from this point to the point I want to be? And where is the point that I want to be? What is that going to look like? And to me, that's a different than an SE thing. But I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts. Okay. So that I think is how being any polar sort of manifests itself with the frame problem, where you have an issue dealing with the chaos, dealing with the fact that all these different things could happen or are happening, and not being able to sort of explore the problem space and figure out, okay, here's sort of a solution to that, or here's the end state where I want to be. I mean, especially when he was little, it really was like he would just shut down. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, because again, it was not very well defined rules. And you could tell him as much as you want, just dribble, or pass the ball or whatever. It was just chaos in his head. I could tell. But then you put him in baseball, you put him in golf, they're fine. Okay, and NI. So your ESTJs and your ESFJs. So the best example that I could think of. So this has to do with the relevance, like figuring out the relevance of the different situations that could unfold given what you do. Okay. And back early in my career, we did one of these like corporate training type things where we were all broken into groups. And it was one of these like team building type exercise, right? And you're all broken into groups. And they try to give you a problem to solve, and you're supposed to solve it as a group. And so the problem, and some of you guys might have seen this because I've heard of other people having to do it too. And it's this survival problem where they give you this scenario and they say, okay, you're trapped in the desert and you have like 10 things in your backpack or something like that. And you need to survive, long enough for somebody to come and rescue you. And here are the 10 items that you have in your backpack. I forget what they are in general, but except for one, which will be important in a second. But you're supposed to rank order them from the most important to the least important. And so we're in this group, and there's these 10 items on the list. And as a group, we're supposed to figure out, okay, what's the most important and what's the least important for surviving. And it'd be things like a mirror or a blanket or, maybe a flashlight, just things like that. But I remember one of them was a packet of salt. Okay. And there was a member of the group who I am positive was an ESTJ to this day, mainly because she was kind of pushy and insisted on, um, that we all sort of agree with her answer. And she insisted that the salt was the most important thing. And I remember this because she was a chemistry or a biology or some sort of major, and was like, you can't survive without salt. Like, you need salt to be able to survive. Okay, maybe, probably, yes. We all need some level of salt to survive. So she insisted that this was, number one on the list. Even though none of us really agreed, we didn't really have a good argument for why we didn't agree, but it just didn't seem right? It seemed like other things seemed to be more important. But she insisted that salt be listed as number one. And of course, for those of you who are survival enthusiasts out there, you probably realize that salt was actually the least important of the 10. In fact, it was actually counterproductive because apparently if you ate the salt, you could dehydrate yourself faster and your chances of survival would go down, right? And so you're actually supposed to stay. Not only was it not the most important, it was detrimental to having it or using it. And I just, and of course, whoever is leading the team building exercise is explaining all the answers, and of course I can just see her face, and of course she just did not, even after everything was explained to her by the people putting on the workshop, just refused to believe it, right? Very ESTJ. And so what's the relevant, or what's going on here? What's the connection to the frame problem? And I think this survival game is really all about relevance, right? What's the most important? What's the least important? You've got a goal, or you have your initial state and your goal state. You're trying to get from your initial state to your goal state. Let's think of all the various things, that we could or could not do to get to our goal state or to build our goal state. And let's sort out the relevant stuff from the irrelevant stuff, right? And again, I'm pretty convinced that she was an ESTJ and just had a problem with sorting out the relevant stuff from the irrelevant stuff. It's kind of the best example I can think of. I'm not entirely sure if it completely addresses the issue, but it's what popped into my mind. And then not only that, but just sort of this insistence, because she wasn't really drawing on her intuition, her introverted intuition. She was drawing on the fact that she was a biology or biochem or whatever major, and in her experience, salt is like very important for life. I don't disagree with that, but not in this situation, not in this context, right? So she's relying too much on this sort of SI type experiential knowledge about the world that, yes, you're going to need salt at some point to survive, but not in this context, right? And, it's sort of the least of your worries at this point. And I remember the rest of us just sort of like, and I wasn't really into all this cognitive function stuff or anything at the time. But looking back on it, the rest of us are probably tapping into our introverted intuition and just being like, really? Is it really that relevant? But, okay, you're the expert here. Go for it. And so, and I think it also sort of manifests itself in sort of the day-to-day real world of ESTJs and ESFJs, in my experience, tend to catastrophize things, right? They tend to, worry about like, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? What if that happens? Especially if you're going off the beaten path, right? And I know I've put up videos before about sort of somebody with introverted intuition dealing with ESFJs or ESTJs, sorry, where, if where the ESTJs and the ESFJs, if they're faced with a problem, they like to double down on the solution that's always worked, right? And the example I give is think of some tribe, way back when, the hunter-gatherer days, and they're living in a small community, and they have some sort of, primitive form of religion where they're sacrificing, people to their gods and praying really hard, for rain. And they've been doing that for generations and generations, and it's always worked. But now all of a sudden, for whatever reason, there's a drought, and you've got the introverted intuitives who are just like, maybe we should just pick up and move like to where the rain is. I was walking past the mountain the other day and I saw it was raining over there. Let's just go over there. Where the ESTJs and ESFJs would be like, oh, I don't know, rather not deal with all that. Let's just pray harder and sacrifice more people, right? And then the gods they'll hear us, and we'll double down on what's always worked for us. And then you get the INFJ or the INTJ trying to explain to them why it probably makes sense to let's just try something new. Let's try something different. And and I think they catastrophize and will sort of think of all these reasons for why they don't want to do it, right? But a lot of times those reasons might be irrelevant, given the situation. And you could probably think of a lot of examples, but they're going to focus on things that are sort of irrelevant and probably not likely to occur, right? But they're comfortable with their SI experience and knowledge of the world, and not so comfortable with this grand new theory that the INFJs and INTJs are coming up with, right? And you deal with this in the business world all the time, because there's a lot of ESTJs, there's a lot of ESFJs. And, to get them off the beaten path and to try something new, very, very difficult, very, very difficult. Because they'll have a million reasons why, they don't want to do it. And no matter how much you try to explain, like, well, that's probably not going to happen, and here's why, and that's probably not going to happen, and here's why, and yeah, that might happen, but do we really care? All that kind of stuff. Nope, they don't want to hear it. So if you're dealing with, the ESTJ dad or the ESFJ mom or vice versa, and you're an INFJ or an INTJ, a lead intuitive, you're going to be constantly fighting that battle of relevance, where you might propose a new solution to a problem and they don't want to hear it. And they'll give you, a million reasons not to do it, whether they're relevant or not. Okay, so that's the frame problem. I'm probably also, I think I might do another video on the Chinese room, Searle's Chinese room, and how intuition also sort of plays into that. But the bigger thing is just, all this excitement over AI, which is great. I'm totally behind it. I think it's, we've had some very interesting developments in the last, few years that I never thought would come to pass, but they haven't figured out this frame problem at all. And that's going to be the big stumbling block. The Searle's Chinese room sort of explains a lot of that as well. But save that for another video. Okay, what's going on with this comment here? Oh, and feel free to leave comments, questions, whatever, about the frame problem. Because again, I'm trying to get my head around how this all sort of works. All right, how can I escape from attachment to my family? Please help me. I'm an INFJ in my mid-40s. Unloved relationship, so I'm used to routine longing for escape. Okay. All right. So I don't want to be dismissive, but I take a I have a very, and I'm going in a totally different path for those of you who have been watching this video. Um, but I have a very, very hard stance against giving individualized, personally tailored advice, especially when it comes to mental health issues or psychological issues or anything like that. Um, I might make a video on this at some point. I've been thinking about it, but I also don't want to come across as too, like, you know, wagging my finger at people. But I think when it comes to like mental health stuff, psychological issues, family relationships, giving advice to people that's personally tailored to their situation. I think there's in my world what we call a fiduciary duty in that, um, where you have both the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. Where the duty of care is like you have to be competent, you have to know what you're talking about, and to some level of professional standards. And the duty of loyalty is putting your client's interest or your patient's interest above yours, right? The advice is in their best interest and not your own personal best interest. And I can't do either of those. I don't think I'm competent enough to be giving people personalized behavioral advice. It's not what I did when I was in grad school. I didn't do counseling. It's a whole different discipline. And then I also don't know most of you out there, and I don't feel like I could put your best interest ahead of mine. I will reserve maybe for a future video my thoughts on other people out there in the MBTI personality community that sort of see themselves as self-help gurus, but I am definitely not one of them. I think giving education is fine. Like, this is just what I see this as being. This is just me trying to educate people or just letting people know what I think about these concepts and what I've learned along the way. It could be right, it could be wrong, but I do see it in the form of just general education. You can take with it what you want, right? But I don't try to give any sort of personalized, individualized advice. I don't think that's appropriate for me to do, and I certainly am not capable of doing it. So I wish you well. I hope it does work out for you. But if you really are having a problem, I think it's bigger than just this INFJ mumbo jumbo and MBTI mumbo jumbo, and seek a professional counselor is really the best advice I could give. So hope that helps. And I realize I'm deflecting the problem, but again, I don't see it as something I should be doling out advice to people, personalized advice in that way. Okay. Hope everybody's doing well, and talk to you soon. Bye.